first place, philosophy is different from all the other fields in that we have to be as broad as possible. In some sense, philosophy has to talk about everything. And we are not the first in object-oriented ontology to use the word object to cover everything that exists. There was, of course, Alexius Meinong in Austrian philosophy 100 years ago. In fact, my use of the word object is trying to pay my debt to the Austrian tradition of Brentano, Husserl, Meinong, Twardowski, these other philosophers who were interested in objects. Usually, in everyday language, object suggests something hard, something that is durable and lasts for a long time, something that is not human or not alive, like a Coke bottle, and something that is real. In object-oriented ontology, though, we talk about humans as being objects. We're not dividing between subject and object. Object is for us the general term that means everything that exists or doesn't exist, such as fictional characters, Batman, Popeye, Darth Vader. All of these characters count as objects. Numbers and other mathematical entities, objects. The Autonomous University of Baja California, an object. Each of you, an object. Myself, an object, and so forth. All right. Now, what I'm going to start by talking about is that most of Western philosophy and most of Western thought in general has been anti-object oriented. Not all of it, but a lot of it. What happens a lot of times with objects is people say that objects aren't real. What's real are the smallest things of which the object is built. So let's say atoms or quarks and electrons. This is what scientific materialism usually does. It says everything that we see is actually not as fundamental as the tiniest particles or strings or whatever other physical things are the smallest from which everything is made. This is a kind of undermining. All right, so overmining is the idea that you don't need this idea of objects. You only need to look at actions, events, appearances, and be suspicious of anything that's hiding underneath. And you find this in most modern and postmodern thinkers, whether it's Derrida, Husserl, Bruno Latour, Alfred North Whitehead, another philosopher I like, similar to Latour. He thinks the relations between things are what is real. So we have undermining and overmining. Now, what usually happens is that the two of them combine together to destroy objects. And I had to invent what I thought was a completely new word. It's reducing the object to its pieces, or reducing an object to its effects. Now, what else is left? Some people might say that's all you can do. These are the two forms of knowledge. If somebody asks you what something is, like if I hold this up and I said, what is this? There are two kinds of answers you can give. There are only two kinds of knowledge available to humans. You can tell me what this is made of. You can say it's a plastic thing with ink inside, or you can tell me what it does. It's used for writing on the board. I've thought about this for years, and I think there is no other kind of knowledge. Knowledge is either saying what a thing is made of or saying what it does. It's either undermining or overmining. And that's fine. We need knowledge to survive. We need this for medicine. We need this for engineering. We need this for economics. We need to know what things are made of and what they do. So we're not trying to eliminate knowledge. We are simply saying that knowledge is not the whole of cognition. There is another kind of cognition that is not a knowledge. It doesn't involve telling what a thing is made of or what it does. Do I have any examples of this? Yes, I have two very good examples. Let's start with philosophy itself. Is philosophy really a kind of knowledge? I say no. Even the etymology of the words, philosophy is about the love of wisdom. It's not about a claim to have any knowledge, the way the sciences and mathematics can claim to have knowledge. Art. No artwork can be replaced by a description of the artwork. Imagine reading a book about, let's say, Picasso or Cézanne, and there were no illustrations. It was just somebody trying to explain what each of the paintings looks like. There would be something wrong. You would not learn enough from that art book. Right? You need to actually see the painting for yourself, see the sculpture for yourself, see the installation art for yourself. It cannot be replaced by prose. And this is what reality is like. Reality cannot be replaced by a set of descriptions. So art and philosophy are together in this way, as is architecture and some other disciplines, which are not primarily producing knowledge. And immaterialism for us is about finding these substantial forms that are in the thing. And of course, you can't do that directly. You cannot translate a hidden thing in itself into prose terms until you hint at it indirectly. And there are a lot of ways to do that. Now, I was going to save most of the materialism for tomorrow's lecture, but just to give you a hint, most history, I think, overmines things. It also undermines it. History is a lot about overmining. Because if you're going to write the history of something, let's say you were going to write the history of the Dutch East India Company. You're going to find the things that it did that had the biggest impacts, right? So you're going to focus on the biggest battles the Dutch East India Company fought, the biggest shipments of spice that it ever did, and so forth. But not every one of those is important to the internal existence of the company, right? Some of the biggest battles it fought did not make the biggest difference to the company. So I brought it, I don't want to spoil it tomorrow, but I'll give you a little taste of it. There's this term symbiosis. And of course this term comes from biology. It comes from an American woman named Lynn Margulis, who was one of the great scientists of the last 50 years. And if, some of you might know about her, but if you don't, the traditional Darwinian theory of evolution, change of species is gradual, right? Big fish have a baby, and it eats the baby of the little fish, and so fish gradually get bigger and stronger and meaner. Evolution is supposed to take place very slowly in that way. There have always been some people who think evolution happens in jumps. There's Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge, but the more interesting one to me is Lynn Margulis. What Lynn Margulis thought is that evolution happens when two life forms come together to form a new species. She theorized back in the 1960s that all the parts in the human cell, only some of them are naturally there, others came from the outside. Right? It was some of the parts of our cells were actually independent bacteria or viruses that came into our cells as parasites way back in history. And then over time, we needed them. We needed some of these to survive when the oxygen level increased or for some other reason. And so we formed a symbiotic relation where we reproduce these viruses and bacteria along with our own cells. And I tried to apply this to history in the case of the Dutch East India Company. And I hypothesized that every historical object, whether it's a person, like your own life, or a historical institution, it will only go through really 5 or 6 changes. And it will come through a symbiosis. I looked at that and I found that not all of the things that are important in the history of the Dutch East India Company actually transformed it. There are only a few. And it's either 5 or 6, I don't remember how many I came up with. There's one person only who changed the nature of the company. There are 2 places and 2 things, I think. And then maybe I added a 3rd thing.
I have read your book, Immaterialism, where you talk about symbiosis and how in the relationship between objects you can produce or generate a new object, taking into account the parts but exceeding these parts as a new object, right?
Yes.
But I was thinking that in your theory, sometimes you assume it's easy to produce a new object between 2 different objects. Sometimes, for example, you say when you observe a tree, the relationship between you as an observer and a tree produces a new object in that intentional act. But in other moments, like in your work, Immaterialism, you assume that it's rare, the symbiosis is rare. So the VOC, this corporation, doesn't change that much, or when this object gets in relationship with another objects. Like, for example, General Cohen changed the DOC, but not all relationships. So how can you clarify that? How can you know when a relationship between two objects produces a new object?
Very good question. We hit the target here. It is true that every time there's a real relation, I think a new object is produced. Otherwise, the two can't perceive each other. The two can't interact with each other. However, I work under the assumption that most of those do not change the ingredients, or they're easily detached in most cases. In the case of the symbiosis, I'm actually there talking about different phases of the same object. So I wouldn't say the Dutch East India Company was maybe I said this in the book, but I wouldn't say it today. I wouldn't say it's a different object every time it makes one of those symbioses, just that it enters a new phase. And once it's passed through those 5 or 6 symbioses on average, it reaches mature form, and then it rises, and then it declines and dies. And I think that's true of most objects, if not all. And what I was working on there is that one of my biggest dissatisfactions with actor network theory, which has inspired me a great deal, I think Bruno Latour is one of the most important living thinkers, is that since it treats all relations as affecting what the thing is, it's not able to distinguish between unimportant and important things except quantitatively. That this one is more important, this is less. So if I have a religious conversion, it's more important, but if one hair falls off my head, it's less important, but it still changes who I am.
Yeah.
Obviously, it doesn't change who I am if the hair falls off the head, and a religious conversion might not even change somebody that much. And I also was working with the intuition that most of the changes that happen in an individual human life are not internal. They happen through interaction with some outside force. As I said today in the lecture, it's not a matter of sitting around in my bedroom and brooding about who am I. It's a matter of making a symbiosis with a person, a country, a profession, a friend, an idea perhaps, to which you devote yourself from then on. And for various reasons, I think this can only happen about 5 or 6 times, because once that happens, you only have a certain number of slots for symbiosis in your life. And after that, you can ripen and increase your influence and then decline. Why do you decline? It's because you are, symbiosis, you overcommit yourself to certain things that may be advantageous now but become disadvantageous when the things change. So in the case of the Dutch East India Company, they were over-symbiosed with spices, or over-linked with spices anyway. And once spices became less important to Europe, obviously it was going to decline. There was no way they could change their business model. And the British took over because tea and chocolate became the important things. So, but your original question was a good one.
Okay.
Sometimes it seems like I'm allowing every interaction to form a new object, yes. But in a way, the symbioses are something less than forming a new object.
Okay.
They're a new phase of the same object.
Okay. But when a symbiosis is occurring, well, it has a new part that incorporates, like General Cohen being
Yes.
A part of BOC.
Yeah.
And this argument that a symbiosis starts a new phase in the object, maybe implicitly has this idea that the essence of the object is changed. Is that right?
That's the question that Levi Bryant and I were debating. Levi didn't like the idea I had that a thing had an essence prior to any relations, because then he thinks a thing can never change. And whereas he thinks things are always changing, the virtual proper being, by acting differently on the world, is changing its essence constantly. My response to that was that the thing doesn't change its essence, it combines with other things. And so it enters a new phase, and that phase might have an essence that's distinct from the essence of the original thing, if it's a symbiotic phase. But the thing itself isn't really going to change. The Dutch East India Company had certain essential conditions built into it. Right? It had to be corporate, it had to be independent from the Dutch government because it was so far away. It had to be a spice monopoly, because and of course it was only Kuhn's treatise that really solidified that. That it has to be a monopoly because otherwise the Dutch cannot survive as an independent country. Spain was trying to conquer them. So, right, again, you ask a very sophisticated question. Does the essence of the thing change or not?
Yeah, because maybe you can say that when General Cohen takes the VOC, the VOC is changed, and well, you can say from first approach, this change is only central, but that new potentiality that we see in VOC was already there, but General Cohen just like liberated that essential qualities and that essential object and manifested it in the central. But can you say that, or maybe the introduction of General Cohen really produces a new composition essentially in the object, and even the other way around, is General Cohen changed in its essence when he takes the VOC?
I think, yeah, the symbiosis with the VOC and Cohen was probably even more important in Cohen's life than it was in the VOC, so that was very important for the latter. Just like I've always said, my symbiosis with Cairo was very important for me and not very important for Cairo, because it's been there centuries. One thing that would have been interesting to ask is, are there other counterfactual possibilities for the book other than the symbiosis with Cohen's treatise? In that case, maybe not, because it's hard to see how it would have survived as a business without exploiting and monopolizing, and that's what the Dutch needed it to do. Even though it was a liberal country, they needed the money at high exorbitant monopoly prices, and so they had to exclude the other European powers and had to monopolize intra-Asian trading as well. So yeah, that's interesting. Another thing that would have been interesting to ask, I'm just realizing now, thanks to your excellent questions, is that to do a comparison of Vogt plus Cohen as a symbiosis or as a new object. Because I find myself in this conversation forced into the strange position that the symbiosis is more powerful than the actual formation of the new object. And that seems counterintuitive. In a way, loose connections are often more powerful. And you see this in sociology. There's the strength of weak ties in sociology. The idea that you gain more opportunities from casual acquaintances than from close friends. Close friends give you the emotional support, but they're not going to get you a new job or a new set of ideas because you were already close to them. Whereas the loose tie can always get closer, and so sometimes that's more powerful. I've also found with age that there's a certain optimum distance from every person. It's not the case that you want to get closer and closer and closer to everybody you meet. Some people, there are a lot of acquaintances where it's best at this distance, not this distance or this distance. And then if you try to make it closer, it's a disaster. And if you get further, it's a disaster. But there's a certain range in there.
Listeners, and you asked tough questions, and then last night I was interviewed at Las Playas and had even tougher questions more, so I look forward to coming back. Right now I'm not living in Los Angeles, I'm living in the Midwest in Iowa and just flying to Los Angeles, but if I move to Los Angeles next year, which I might, I look forward to visiting you again sometime. It's not very far, just a few hours in my car. One of the key points about Kant's conception of beauty is that it cannot be conceptualized. You cannot give rules for what makes something beautiful. Like you cannot say symmetrical things are more beautiful, because sometimes they're not. Sometimes asymmetrical things are more beautiful. You cannot say happy things are more beautiful than sad things, no, because sometimes sad artworks are better than happy ones. There's no rule you can make for what makes an artwork better or worse conceptually. You actually have to experience it, and this is what Kant calls taste. Right? Taste is the kind of non-conceptual sense we have of the beautiful and the not beautiful. All right, so that's a thing I like about Kant. I also like about Kant the idea that the artwork is somehow cut off from its effects on the outside worlds. This is called formalism. Okay, let me now get to the meat of my argument though, which is that there are two things that Greenberg and Fried say that need to be reversed, and this gives us a new sense of art. Let's start with Michael Fried, who's the younger of the two and is still alive, as I mentioned. He just visited us in Los Angeles last year. Michael Fried is against theatricality. The way to avoid theatricality in painting, Michael Fried thinks, is that the figures in the painting should look like they are paying attention to each other, not to us. If it looks like they're paying attention to us, the effect seems very cheap, according to Fried. It seems like a melodramatic kind of painting. They should be absorbed with each other. Now there's a problem with this, two problems. One of them is that Fried even has to admit that this doesn't last for very long in French painting. If you look at paintings by Manet, who's the first modern painter according to Fried, usually there's one person in the Manet painting who is looking at you directly. That's because Fried said it became impossible to paint anymore in a way where they looked absorbed with each other, it looked fake. And so the way to cancel that was to have one person looking directly at you. And so even Fried, who's anti-theatrical, admits there has to be a theatrical component to art, which means the person has to be, the beholder, the person looking at the art, has to be involved in it. Even he admits that. So that's the first thing I want to say in an object-oriented interpretation of art, that theatricality is inevitable. Because if there's no one experiencing the art, it's not art. Right? If all humans die in a nuclear war or a plague, the paintings will still be around, the sculptures will still be around. But unless there are some animals who recognize it as art, it won't be art. In other words, just like ethics is made of two ingredients, the object and the person, aesthetics is made of two ingredients, the work and the beholder. They come together. They form a new hybrid object, just like hydrogen and oxygen together make water. You can't have water without hydrogen and oxygen. You cannot have a painting without the object and the beholder. Greenberg has a different issue. If you've ever read Clement Greenberg, he is the one who thinks that content of paintings is basically unimportant. Right? He's famous, he's a champion of abstract art. He says content is literary anecdote. It's just a story that ought to be in a novel. It shouldn't be in a painting. All painting should do, he says, is it should realize that it's essentially a flat canvas. The background is a flat canvas. And all of the content of the painting should be letting us know that it realizes it's a flat canvas. This is why he loves Cubism the most, right? Cubism paints very unimportant content usually. It's a violin or a candlestick, but it's painted in many different planes, as if to show us, yes, I realize we're in a flat medium, painting is a flat art, and therefore I'm flattening the whole person's face onto the surface, different sides of the face at once. There's a problem with this, which is his assumption that the background is one, the background is flat, and all of the content is dealing with the same flatness. In object-oriented ontology, of course, every object has its own hidden background. So this has a real object behind it that you're only seeing in distorted form through perception. This is a real object that you're only seeing in translated form. And so every object has its own medium for object-oriented ontology. And so therefore, we also favor artworks where the elements are more loosely connected. They're not necessarily woven together into a perfect whole, where the individual elements of an artwork all have their own depth. It's not just the artwork as a whole that has a depth.
I have a couple of questions about your aesthetics, especially, well, the first question is about the role of the artist, because I think you have, like, I would say, an ambivalent take on the artist. For one hand, you take the artist as a role model for philosophy. Philosophers have to look to objects as the artist looks to the objects, yes, without reducing them to its parts or relations. But on the other hand, you talk about this basic aesthetic unit from which you can theorize about the aesthetic experience. And in that part of your aesthetics, you take the artwork from one hand and the beholder from the other hand. And then the artist is out from the basic aesthetic unit. I was thinking about if O can take into account the aesthetic experience of the artist as part of the, not just a role model, as just an example, maybe even an instrumental way to take the artist for philosophy, but a way to think about the experience that the artist has in aesthetic.
Yes, of course, Nietzsche and Heidegger are the two who really stress the importance of art from the artist's point of view. I'm completely against them on that, as great as they are in other ways. I think when you write something, for example, you want to write something with the experience of reading it in mind. The experience of the author, at least for me, is not that great. It's very stressful. It's constant frustration. It's a lot of procrastination. It's going back through and reading your newly published book and cringing because you should have chosen this word, or you missed a typographical error. So I don't... there's a certain drive that leads you to produce books, or I suppose artworks, but it's not as pleasurable as the experience of the beholder, let's say. And so I think they're wrong about that. Nietzsche, of course, does this because of his hero-worshipping sort of Übermensch reasons that the artist is somehow a higher type. And Heidegger's probably following in his footsteps with that. Nietzsche even calls it a woman's aesthetics. It's too passive, that focuses on the beholder. I'm all in favor of the woman's aesthetics, if you want to call it that. I wrote an essay about this that's not out yet. The woman's aesthetics of architecture. Because it's the beholder who has the privileged position. There's no artwork without a beholder.
So what would an object-oriented architecture be like? Well, you could say there have been three great waves of philosophers influencing architects over the last half century. The first, of course, was Heidegger. And Heidegger wrote his famous essay, Building, Dwelling, Thinking, about architecture. And this has manifested itself in what they call phenomenological architecture. And some of this is fairly famous. Peter Zumthor in Switzerland has won the Pritzker Prize for the best architect some years ago. And what they are focused on in phenomenological architecture is a certain human experience. So they use very beautiful wood, and the metal sparkles, and they have the sunlight looking very nice. The second wave was Derrida, which was in the 70s, more the 80s. 1988, there was a major show on deconstructivist architecture. So the Derridian influence in architecture is more about trying to disrupt our sense of comfort and safety. It's not about dwelling in the homeland. It's about trying to make us feel estranged from that. So you might have slanted windows, or you might have a skyscraper painted pink, or anything that's designed to disrupt your sense of normalcy. Then the third wave, which started in the 1990s, was Deleuze, of philosophers influencing architecture. And I think one of the obvious influences of Deleuze is, since he talks about continuous becoming, you get buildings that are very gracefully curved. There aren't corners or sharp edges. And so if you know Zaha Hadid's work, she unfortunately died 2 years ago. She does these beautiful curving, flowing shapes, and was one of the greatest architects of our time. So object-oriented ontology arrived in architecture at a time when they're looking for new ideas. A couple of people have said object-oriented ontology will be the next great philosophical influence on architecture. That might be premature, because there haven't been really any buildings constructed yet that claim an object-oriented influence. But I want to tell you there are a lot of people trying it. I think there are two extreme options, both people that I know. One of them is my colleague Tom Wiscombe at SCI-Arc, and he says there are three techniques he would use to emphasize the points of object-oriented ontology. The first is what he calls objects in a sack, where you do have basic geometrical shapes in the building, but they are covered over by a loose outer envelope that looks like a blanket or a sheet that has been thrown over the objects. So you can sort of see traces of the objects underneath the outer layer, but you're not exactly sure what they are, which of course relates to the object-oriented idea of an object that's withdrawn from direct access. You can only hint at it, you can allude to it. The second technique he uses is raising buildings above the ground as an attempt to decontextualize them, because he thinks there's been too much emphasis on the building blending in too nicely with the ground. So he raises it above on a plinth. The third technique he uses is he creates what he calls tattoos on the surface of the building. They are arbitrary decoration that have no relation with the structure. So it creates a tension between the building structure and its outward ornament. And those three ideas and others he's been exploring in his own work. So that's more what you would... That's something that sounds very much like an object-oriented technique. None of that is surprising. It's all quite powerful, but none of it will surprise you if you know what O is about, object-oriented ontology. The other extreme, Mark Foster Gage, who's the Assistant Dean of Architecture at Yale, and I'll be actually teaching a studio with him at Yale next fall, so I'll get to talk to him a lot about this. Whereas Tom Wiscombe is trying to hint at something deeper in the building that you can't see, which is that real object sensual quality line. Mark Foster Gage stays on this lower line, sensual object and sensual quality. And if you have your phone and want to Google his, right now, Google Mark Foster Gage skyscraper, and you're going to see this wonderfully crazy building he has proposed for New York City, the West Side. It looks neo-Gothic. It looks like all kinds of crazy objects pasted together. Donald Duck and geometrical shapes, and I hope it gets built. It will be the craziest thing in the New York skyline. And what he's doing there is he's trying to graft objects together. He's not trying to say that there's something hidden that you can't see. It's all there on the surface. But you end up with this crazy ornamentation with objects fused together that don't really belong together. So that's the other possible technique you could use. And there are others, but these are the two extremes right now, I would say, of how people are using object-oriented architecture.
You talk about the possible but not necessary relationship between aesthetics and politics,
Yes.
or the artwork and the political context. And I actually have a quote in the last paragraph in your aesthetics chapter in object-oriented ontology, one of your last books. You say this triple O holds no grudge against the social political interpretation or effectiveness of art, but simply insists that not all the elements of the context of an artwork are relevant to that work.
That's right.
And that an artwork either admits or forbids its surroundings to enter through a fairly rigorous process of selection. Mm-hmm. But I think you just sketch this possibility, but I wanted to ask you if you can elaborate this rigorous process of selection of the artwork, because it's not specified, and also what is the role of the beholder, because if the beholder is part of the basic aesthetic unit, doesn't the beholder has the possibility to be part of that process of selection?
Yes, in fact, I've been accused sometimes of giving the beholder too much power and not accepting the autonomy of the artwork enough. But there's one sense in which I do emphasize the autonomy. Mm-hmm. Here's an example. I like reading Stephen Greenblatt's stuff, the leading new historicist. I read his biography of Shakespeare, Will in the World, which is of course necessarily somewhat speculative because there's not that much information about him. All that stuff is great. However, Greenblatt's book does not account for the fact, at least not sufficiently, that you can produce Shakespeare in 2018 in Singapore and people are still going to react to it very strongly. It's still really good drama and really good literature if you just happen to read it. And so you need to be able to account for that as well. In a way, the better a work is, the less connected it is with its time and place. The more it exits that and it's like a space capsule that escapes a dying planet and is able to land somewhere else and still continue to live. Works, and not just in literature and the arts, but human works of any kind, like buildings, have a certain staying power. We had Bruce Sterling, the futurist, the cyberpunk author, come to SIRE a couple weeks ago, and he said something very interesting I hadn't thought about before. He was talking about 50 years from now, and the reason 50 years is because he said he's pretty sure he'll be dead in 50 years. He's in his early 60s, and yet all the kids in the audience are going to be in their early 70s, so they might still be, a good chance they'll still be alive. So let's ask about 2068. And he asked, he's talking about Italy, what will the most famous buildings in Italy be 50 years from now? And the answer was the same ones that are famous now, with maybe one or two additions. Mm-hmm. It's going to be all the Renaissance stuff and the Venetian stuff. Because they've already lasted this long, surely they're going to last another 50 unless they collapse. And so in a way, that's what the classics in a way are more futuristic than contemporary stuff, because they're pretty much guaranteed to last longer. That's not always true. Some stuff that is considered people don't really read Horace anymore, whereas Horace was one of the pillars of education in Latin. No one really studies Latin anymore. So now we read Virgil's Aeneid, maybe, if we're classically educated. Maybe we read Ovid's Metamorphoses. Horace, you have to be kind of a Latinist specialist, at least in the US, to read that. So that's an example. Dickens is kind of out of fashion. Hemingway's a little out of fashion now. I like Hemingway, but H.P. Lovecraft was really out of fashion until about 10 years ago, and then he really was resurgent.
Reemerged, yeah.
So you can't always predict which way things are going to go. But time helps. Time helps get some perspective on which things are period pieces and which are not. And I don't think anything definitive has been written yet on how canons are formed. It's simply been looked at only politically in terms of oppression and exclusion. And I think there's more to it than that.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
That's all? Okay.
Yeah, that's all.
I love talking for hours, but thank you for doing this.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe in another visit we can talk again.
I'd love to. Love to come back to Tijuana.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.